Welcome everybody. Again, for those of you who I've not had a chance to meet, I'm Dr. Ray Comiskey. I'm current president of Jefferson College, at least for the next year. And this is our monthly speaker series, and we're so glad to have you here today. We've got a great program, and it's built again on the theme, talking about Little House on the Prairie. So our program today is titled Finding Missouri's Frontier in Little House, and it's being presented by Professor of History, Dr. Scott Holzer. Dr. Holzer holds a PhD in American history, and for the past 27 years, he's taught history, political science, and the humanities at the University of Mississippi, Alcorn State University, and of course, Jefferson College. In his 23 years here at Jefferson College, he's regularly taught Missouri history, where he often uses Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie to explore themes in Missouri's 19th century frontier experience. Now, next month, on October 16th and 17th, Jefferson County will welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning author Caroline Fraser for 3 appearances. She will discuss her book, Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and we'll have a variety of events around the county that will allow readers of all ages to participate in conversations and experiences that enrich our understanding of the Missouri Prairie and frontier experiences. Several libraries in the county, along with our own Jefferson College Library, will host a variety of presentations, book discussions, story times, and more, including today's program. So our program today is to highlight the Little House on the Prairie, kind of starting our discussion. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Scott Holzer. Scott?
The library at Jefferson College got a grant for with the libraries of Jefferson County, grant from the Missouri Humanities Council, and they were able to get Pulitzer Prize winning author Caroline Fraser to come. And if you don't know, the Pulitzer in American history, and in this case biography, Pulitzer for biography and autobiography, those books are always outstanding. So if you are interested, she is just a real intellectual powerhouse. It's really a coup for us to have her. Now, my experience with Little House was reading it to my children with my wife, and I was teaching Missouri history, and it occurred to me, even though it's in Independence, Kansas, which is right in the southeastern corner of Kansas, I realized that a lot of things that we cover and try to get to in the experience of frontier history is in this book. And really, Laura Ingalls Wilder's series fits this kind of, she wrote it in the 1930s, but it fits into kind of the American tradition of juvenile literature with Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. And it's written for young readers, but it also resonates with older readers. And for if you're not familiar with the Laura Ingalls Wilder series, the Little House in the Big Woods is up there in Wisconsin. It's really a lark that this family ended up in Kansas. They're really kind of an upper Midwestern family. There's some circumstances there that are really odd. Pa, Charles Ingalls, did not serve in the Civil War, and Caroline Fraser talks about this, that he kind of is missing. They don't really know where he was between 1862 and 1865. So everybody in the North was joining the Union Army. And the next thing you know, he moves to Missouri, which was probably the worst place to move if you're from Wisconsin. It was a very divided state. He was in Chariton County. It didn't work out. He didn't like the land that he and his brother-in-law were working. And he goes back and gets his family, and he's been hearing about this land that's opening up in southern Kansas. So he actually moves into an area that belongs to the Osage Indians. It's going to be a problem. He fits into this category in the American experience that we always talk about. It's the squatter class. These are the people that are literally chasing the frontier. Sometimes they're ahead of the frontier. These would be the people that would be attacked by Native Americans because they are in Native American territory and they're beyond the protection of their colony, of their state, or the United States government. This is a very famous George Caleb Bingham painting. He painted this in 1850 to explain to people in the East that there's a class of Americans that you don't know about. They are very modest people. They are looking for the good land. A lot of them are hunters. They're going to live off of the bounty of whatever the environment can give. I don't know if you can see this, but it is, I believe, George Killen Bingham is making a statement. Right there in the shadows, that's the woman of the cabin. So there's a kettle of water right here being boiled. She is working, and that is really hard work. The men are just there talking. I do believe that is a and I will let you comment on that. The one thing about George Caleb Bingham is a Missouri painter from the Missouri River Valley. It has a look of the Missouri River Valley, although it would have been, it was full of Germans, at least, from Jefferson City to St. Louis. He always loved putting a dog in a photo, too. True to the American experience. This is an allegorical painting. It's called American Progress. It's often used in American history textbooks of manifest destiny as we're fulfilling Thomas Jefferson's dream of going from coast to coast. You can see the book in her hand is supposed to be the Enlightenment education, and then the other hand has the telegraph wire. Wherever the railroad went, the telegraph, it was a 2-for-1 deal followed. The wires are being strung up. And you can see the painter, John Gast, was a Prussian who lived in Brooklyn. There's the Brooklyn Bridge right there. It wasn't up yet. It was already approved, and they were building it, so he's very optimistic. But in this painting, this is that squatter class. That would be the Ingalls. And it is important to what we're going to talk about. The Native Americans are in the shadows, and they're just supposed to retreat to the west. The bison as well. You have a grizzly bear. I believe that's an elk. It's kind of a tweener between an elk and it's really probably a red deer, which in Europe is an elk, elkish. So there's 3 things I really want to touch on that I found really useful in classes talking about the Missouri frontier that you can get out of this story. I should say we treat it often as nonfiction. Everybody in the book is real. The experiences are generalized. Some of them are fabricated. One thing that Carolyn Fraser shows so well is that Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, taught her, if you don't know the details, make them up and tell a better story. It's straight out of the handbook of Mark Twain. Make the story better. Now, just the 3 themes I want to touch on real quickly would be the Osage Indians, really a tremendous tribe that we don't talk enough about in any context of American history. What they call the culture of manners, and that may seem like an odd word, but what that means to social historians is how people live their lives. And this is the intangible stuff that people enjoy so much, and what makes that book so great, even though it's classified as fiction. She's telling family stories, and that's really the ultimate purpose that impelled her to write. You know, her father died in 1902, and then her mother died 20 years later, and then her older sister died a couple years after that. And here she is, the oldest member of her original nuclear family, and she feels like she wants to preserve their memory and conserve these stories and put them down in writing. And so she had toyed with this at the time of her father's death, and then she brings them forward. And so it doesn't really matter if the stories or the chronology doesn't line up. There's a real essence of truth there that works. So that's what we mean by culture of manners. And then the last thing is just the environment. One thing about people that lived on the frontier or in agricultural societies, they are outside. And so they have this appreciation. If you haven't noticed, most of our environmentalists, our tradition comes from the West. It was the last region that was settled. And so people saw and had the strongest memory of that experience disappearing. And when you get to the plains, you just have these incredible, the great herds. And within one lifetime, less than a lifetime, they disappear. the Great Plains of the United States were right there with the incredible richness of the Serengeti that we see in documentaries. So it really, it struck people. Even the people that participated in its transformation were really in love with the place. So if you don't know, we are right on the edge of Osage territory. Technically, Jefferson County wasn't in it. They didn't like the Mississippi River because it was like a freeway system for Native American travel. So there is one Osage story that we have people have heard of as the Heads Creek Massacre. That was really outside their territory. There's some explanation that goes on there, but that was the Osage Indians. They lived on the Osage River. They're a really interesting tribe. They were what we call a client tribe. They were in an economic relationship with the French, particularly Pierre Laclede and Auguste Chouteau. And they lived in the east in most of the year, but they did make periodic forays onto the plains. So technically, when the Ingalls family comes in contact with the Osage, they're still in their home territory. They've just been kicked out of the woodland areas, the Ozarks of Missouri and Arkansas. These are just the maps of the displacement. Today, the Osage are in Oklahoma, like so many eastern tribes. But this area here, they lost in 1808. The American agent who did that was William Clark. One of his skills that he learned on the Lewis and Clark expedition was how to negotiate. And this last little bit of territory before they put into Oklahoma is the Osage strip of Kansas. So Paul is going to move right into there. So technically they're in Kansas, but it is the Missouri tribe. It's weird to me when I moved here that we spend so much time on the Cherokee. They're a tribe that was passed through on the Trail of Tears. We have a Trail of Tears State Park, but this was more or less the Osage part. Now, this is interesting, and this is where Little House on the Prairie really started to intrigue me when I started reading Caroline Fraser's book. La Soldat Duchesne, Soldier of the Oak, he's in the book. He's the chief that Pa talks to. Well, he was a real chief, but he was a chief that went to Philadelphia when Thomas Jefferson was president. So what happened was, Laura Ingalls was like about 4 years old when this happened, and she wanted to find an Indian chief, and she contacted some experts in the 1930s, and they found this chief and gave her the name. They just didn't get it to the right time. So, when I read, when I was reading with my daughters, and she gets the description absolutely correct. Anthropologically, the only bit of hair they have is it's called a roach on the back of their head for men. They have no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no hair, except on the back here. And they kept that crop of hair to tie adornments to. The men really love to put things in their ears, paint themselves, particularly with red. And so she describes all that perfectly. I believe that she got some experts of the day to help her. These are just some George Catlin paintings. George Catlin was an Eastern painter that went out to the plains in the 1830s. Some of the best Indian, he's not a great painter, but he's a great cultural preserver of Indian culture at the time. They had two chiefs, an Earth Chief and a Sky Chief. This is the Earth Chief, Sky Chief. That is a war club that he's holding. The name Clermont is French. The Chouteaus, especially the younger brother Pierre, they both had French families in St. Louis, but they had Indian families, so they're very connected. It is significant that they were so closely tied to the French because in about 1870, when the Ingalls encountered the Osage, they find the one tribe that has about more than 150 year experience with whites. Everywhere else, it is absolute bloodshed. It's just a matter of who has the upper hand, whether it's the Comanche in Texas with the Cynthia Parker story, or up in the Dakotas. Nobody knows about the Dakota War that Minnesota had during the Civil War. It's the bloodiest uprising in American history. So, I mean, the frontier is on fire. Laura Ingalls spends a lot of time with describing the Indian children and women, and she gets it more or less right. She probably had some help. She describes naked Indian babies. That is not an insult. If the weather permitted, children often ran without clothing until the age of 5. They don't talk about the painted part, but that's part of the morning prayer. The Osage were known for being particularly religious. They did an hour prayer every morning, and they were they're the biggest Indian tribe. Jefferson called them the giants of the woods. They generally were over 6 feet tall. They were bigger than the average American. So this is Garth Williams. He's the, you may have seen these pictures if you've seen the book. He did the drawings in the second edition that came out in the 1950s. He's an Englishman, so he doesn't really know American culture very well. That's not a good papoose right there. I mean, you're gonna bounce that baby right out, but you. I have so many Osage paintings. I'm not gonna show you just one more. I put this in because Jefferson County is a big bow hunting area, and the Osage were some of the best bow bowyers around. Just so you know, that bow there is probably strung to about 35 to 40 pounds, much lighter than what we do. But that would be a little old man, part of the tribal council. That's where all the power was. So Europeans and Americans were always going to those chiefs trying to get everything done. There's this little council of your elders, people who'd seen stuff and knew stuff. So they were usually neglected. Right. You can tell he's been to see the president. He's got the presidential medal, and the St. Louis Arch, the Museum of the West has that great display. That's where we get the idea for the coins that we have in our pockets and purses. Those Indian peace medals that have the presidential portraits on them. So this is another the teepees, and that's correct. The Osage did that. But they also did the classic Eastern Woodland Lodge. It just depended where you were. These would be covered with mats, as described by Zebulon Pike. And they usually went out for seasonal hunting, kind of like the way Daniel Boone did, out of his son Nathan Boone's home up there in St. Charles. By the way, the creek that Nathan Boone built that house is called Femme Osage Creek, the French for Osage woman. So this is stylized. That's not exactly what their house looked like, but they built their house on the Osage Trace. So there are Indians coming down this trail all the time. The Caroline Fraser says that there are probably many more incursions into their house than just the 2 they have in the book. And you have to remember, Pa has chosen, this is the squatter idea, this land's not being used appropriately, we're gonna take it and farm it. So the Indians say, you're in our land. Now, what probably mitigates violence is that they've had a long-standing relationship, first with the French and then with the Americans. Their dog, Jack, had a showdown on the trace one day, and it'll lead to Pa chaining him up, but there was no violence in this. The Native Americans used bows to hunt and guns to fight. This is, by the way, these are galley proofs that I'm showing, so there's some drawing on there. This is one of the times when 2 Osage warriors came in and made Ma make some cornbread. There is a good bit of anti-Indian sentiment expressed in the book. I'm not sure if you know this or not, but I found it to be very useful because at least it gives a contemporary view of the friction of the times. It may be more problematic, I think, going forward in the elementary school curriculum. It'll be a school board issue, I suspect. One time, a different visit, they took foodstuffs and all of Pa's canned furs. And that was the one thing that they made so much money on, trading with the French. And I didn't know this at all. I was really impressed by Carolyn Fraser. She found out that the United States government had stopped paying the Osage after the Civil War, and that's one thing that pushed them to sell their land and move into Indian territory. The Oklahoma Indian Territory was full, and so then they went to the Cherokee and made the Cherokee sell half of their reservation to the Osage. So it gets very complicated. You can see where so many of these tribal rivalries come from. So they call it a jamboree, and they were just sure as a war dance, and they were coming for them. The one thing about all Plains Indians, that they usually had ceremonial dances before big events. They had 2 annual hunts on the plains, and they were right next to it. They could hear it. They're just sure that they're about to all be slaughtered. Nothing ever happened in the book. It's very interesting. They went off and disappeared. They could never make sense of it. They're following their routine calendar. And then the last parade out, that's where Soldat Duchesne leads the people out. They think now that they were going to Oklahoma. If you are interested in the Osage, and they're a tremendously interesting tribe, they really adapt in their couple hundred years in their encounters. We have this book at the library. It is spectacular. I'm always trying to push books. So let's just talk about culture and manners. I don't talk much about the wagon train, but they arrive in the classic American way to the west. Conestoga wagon. Caroline Fraser says Pa's a hunter, trapper, poet, romantic, musician. Not the best farmer, never made any money. Most of these squatters will not. The problem of American agriculture still is with us, that people are always chasing that frontier and trying to see if they can get a leg up. We've been worrying about these fires in the Amazon. It is actually kind of the same experience that we're talking about. The farmers are chasing the frontier, the indigenous people are on the edge. It's still going on. It's a really beautiful thing. It makes me want to play fiddle, because maybe my daughters will write a book about me, but it's a love letter to her father, that little house in the prairie. That's Mr. Edwards, supposedly the man from Tennessee. How a man moved to Kansas from Tennessee in 1869 is beyond me, because that was just the border war between Missouri. That'd be the last place you'd move. So Caroline Fraser goes and runs the census. There is a Mr. Edward, couple houses down. He's from England. And I'm sure the little girl knew he talked in a very funny way. And the older Laura Ingalls Wilder assumed he must have been a Southerner. You can see they're working on the house. They've been working on the house all day. They dance and they fiddle dance. By the way, George Kitler Bingham has all kinds of jolly boatmen dancing, 19th century. It was men who often did the dancing. This is the culture of manners that we're talking about, the stuff that you do every day, the chores that give you so much structure. Yeah, out in a wagon. If you read that book, though, she is absolutely trying to keep civilization alive. She wants to keep the manners, keep the behavior. And there's a gender role of what people do, but Pa chops the wood, draws the water. There's a drawing of a boot jack. That would be something you do every day, because you don't have a lot of pairs of shoes. You have one pair of shoes. The rituals. They get along. Not only is there a Cherokee trail there, the original, before they get the Chisholm Trail out of Texas, they tried to cheat and run cattle from Texas to Kansas City. That was the nearest railhead, and so that didn't work out because there were so many outlaws. This is the age of Jesse James and all those bushwhackers rustling cattle. That Pa managed to get a cow that had a calf, and they couldn't drive it. They couldn't drive the calf. They couldn't drive the nursing mother, so they just gave it to him. So he thought he was going to milk a wild longhorn. Pardon?
He's on the wrong side.
Yeah. It's a failed effort all the way around. That's a picture of the Ingalls in 1860. young and hopeful, chasing the future. That's a picture after the Little House on the Prairie on their way to South Dakota. I just put the picture in because you see all these pictures of Garth Williams, and he's actually drawing him the way he looked. It just shows you that Pa was a hipster before everybody else. And of course, the Ingalls girls. I like the gingham dresses. I'm sure that Caroline Ingalls sewed those, and also the outfit for Carrie. The Grace is not here yet. So there's in the culture of manners, it seems like this is a family of all daughters. It's very domestic. It seems like this is a more female-centric book. But and I had some young men kind of going, oh, I'm not really sure about this book. There's 5 chapters about building a house. There's nothing more American than I'm going to build a house, the American dream. And Pa, he's in an area, they are in an area that would be called the Cross Timbers. It's prairie, but if you go down into the watershed, there are trees. So he goes down and lumbers there and hauls everything up. Now he tries to do this by himself. Inevitably, one man cannot do it alone. He's going to need help. Neighbors will help. They use a tarpaulin from the wagon. It's the classic use. Agriculture is still like this. Farming is like this. You always have to be innovative and inventive. Get the roof up. They move inside. That's a dirt floor, by the way. And you can see they got a chair. Later, I was really impressed that this is what Laura Ingalls Wilder remembered as an old woman, how her father made the roof and the floor. And a floor that was really so smooth that you would not be able to pick up a splinter if you walked it barefoot. Hasn't had time to do the chairs yet. The stones. This is classically American. The salvaged chimney from stones found in the creek. In the book, of course, Pa's tired after he's done this because he's done it all in one day. Picked the stones up, put them in a wagon, pulled by the horse, taken up, and then he's built it. So he's taken a blow. I put the quote in here because this is so true to anybody who's moved to the frontier. You have this very rustic, very rough life. And then when they get the hearth set up, Ma has a china doll that she puts up there that no one's allowed to touch. And it symbolizes everything that you strive for, that little bit of civilization. But Laura Ingalls, even in her late adulthood, she pointed at the little China woman and yelled when, only Carrie did not care about it. She pointed at the little China woman and yelled when Mary and Laura told her, no one but Ma could touch it. So she's gigging her sister, still decades later. Like the younger sister had a fit because she couldn't touch the doll. If you've ever, a little scorekeeping. It's such a weird thing. You could talk about chimney fires, you could tell somebody about chimney fires, but when you read about it, it's just an everyday occurrence. The very top of it was made with mud and sticks. At some point it builds up with soot and creosote and it catches on fire. Usually they were tilted away from the house and you would go up there with a stick or some sort of pole and push it over. And you want to get it before the entire wood house burns down. But it was an experience that was widely shared. That was usually how your house burned down. There is a haystack there. Pa really liked Kansas because he didn't have to make a lot of haystacks like he would have up in Wisconsin. I just have a few pictures. Now this is beyond the cross timbers. Once you get out into the prairie, everybody built with sod until you got enough money to buy boards from the east. This guy is going to be a bachelor until he can get a wood house. He does have a doghouse though, built in. Here's a dog that probably helped them hunt as well as kind of be a watch. It's kind of bleak. Let's jazz this up.
What year is this?
This would be in the 1890s. These people were probably German or Swedish. They were recruited usually by railroads. This is closer to the experience. Young daughters, farmer. Daughters would work, but they always kind of secretly wanted sons because they were thinking about the free male labor that they're going to get later on. This poor woman is posed next to the sod house because she spends so much of her time there. In the 19th century, this is called separate spheres, that idea that these two realms. You have a family economy going on where it's all hands on deck, everybody works, but there are roles. Carolyn Fraser describes this. I had not heard this before, but this is apparently on the Prairie community. Women that were trapped, especially if it was a dirt house, which is the way they referred to it. I live in a dirt house. They'd go shack wacky, as cabin fever if you're pent in all winter. By the way, that's a lot of people to be in a tiny little. I mean, it literally is the stuff of kind of what we think of the Siberian steppe. These winter huts. Well, what's wrong with it? Just to give us some hope. This is a family that made it. You can see the original kind of, that would be the style of house that the Ingalls had. This is all these pictures are from the Dakotas. So in farming, you never get rid of anything. You keep it. And then they finally got the money, they came into it, and they're being successful, so they buy the boards from the east, and they build a nice kind of Victorian house that we know. This is a posed picture. They're trying to show what the domestic chores they do. You can tell they're middle class, upper middle class, because the dog doesn't hunt. What I really like about the two things I like about the picture is the bicycle. Out of Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck, Prairie women were huge consumers of bikes because they could actually go and keep the female network of friends alive. It was real common to see women pedaling 5-6 miles. Usually it was a lot easier when the wind was at your back, but that was a huge prairie purchase. The two little children on the side, seen but not heard. They recognize this is going to be a bad day. The well comes, really important. Pa was drawing water, bad water as they described it, from the creek, and so he built a nice well. Made sure he had to cover it to keep the children from falling in the well, which is much more dangerous than a swimming pool. This is supposed to be a man's job in the domestic responsibilities, but on the frontier, women again and again and again did everything men had to do, and that has huge consequences. This is from North Dakota. This woman is pumping water. What I like about this picture is it's got that classic 19th century hourglass, so she's pumping water in a corset, right? And so, I mean, it is a form of body binding, and this is why 19th century women often fainted, because they cannot expand their lungs. And not only is that's not a problem for her, she's gonna do the job that the man, we don't know why he's not there doing it, she's gonna do it. The West, pardon?
She wanted a drink.
Cookie. I imagine she's preparing a meal or cleaning up for one. It's a problem when we tell the story of the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote, because in the West, all the Western states had already granted women the right to vote. It was about half the country. And they actually were lobbyists for their sisters in the East. And it comes from the fact it's hard to say you don't deserve a vote because you're doing everything a man does already. California, I think Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote, and Utah followed quickly, the Rocky Mountains, then it jumped to the West Coast, and then it jumps increasingly towards the East. So about half the country had women had the right to vote when the 19th Amendment was finally passed, so all women could vote. And the neighbor's helping him dig the well. He passes out in the bottom of the well. Pa's got to jump down there, but he can't pull him up. So there's Caroline helping him. when he can't put those logs up to finish the size of the house, have an accident, falls on Ma. Pretty much, sorry, Caroline. The log was on her foot, Pa lifted the log, Ma pulled her from under it, Pa felt her to see if there were any bones were broken. If she has a compound fracture, she will probably die. They call it back in the day blood poisoning. No bones broken. I'm all right, Charles, it's just my foot. Now this is her daughter recalling, and then treating it that night. Pa kept pouring hot water in the tub, which Ma's foot was soaking. Her foot was red from the heat and the puffed ankle began to turn purple. Ma took her foot out of the water and bound strips of rag tightly around the ankle. I can manage, she said. I mean, it's the stoicism that would make a Roman proud. So one last thing, and just the nature. This is blackberry picking. There's just all these intangibles that we can still do that are in there that just are seared into our memory. But this was a universal experience that she talks about making it into syrup. You can tell that Jack's a watchdog because Pa wants to hunt. So the dog is part of the family, but not part of the economy of making food. Just an iconic American experience, the geese of the fall and spring. And it's nice to see that the geese have come back so well because it's throughout American history. You have people referencing it from Native Americans to whoever's the latest people on the land. The picnic, which in 19th century America was the event where whatever you're doing, it's downtime and then you get to socialize. And of course, the girl's playing. Of course, she never caught that squirrel, that chipmunk, because there would be a story about how her finger had this big chunk taken out. But the plains were full of little creatures because there were so many predators. Another classic childhood. This is when he's building the chimney. They go down the creek. Tells them not to go in beyond their ankles, so one goes into their knees and the other one walks in there and goes, it hurts my feet, I'm not going in. It's like the family vacation in a nutshell. And Garth Williams, he must have looked at an American ornithology book because he really got the prairie chicken down. I was very impressed with that. If you read closely, Laura Ingalls Wilder identifies many of the species that occur. She was true to the agricultural way. In touch with what was around her. He got it. Yeah, you can. This is a bird that Missouri Conservation Department is really spending a lot of time bringing back. They're quite threatened, and that's mostly because the prairie has changed so much. We don't have those natural grasses like we used to, but they're coming back. I like the scrutiny. They're trying to impress hen. Couple last things. They have malaria. It's called fever or ague. And the doctor that saves them is an African-American man from the East. He was a free black before the Civil War. For all the anti-Indian sentiment that's in there, and it's usually expressed by neighbors, it's really remarkable that they're just so easily accepted, because this was a time of significant racism. It may help that Caroline's family was from New England, which was the stronghold of abolitionism. But he brings in a bitter drink, which we would recognize as quinine. He probably, Caroline Fraser says, probably delivered little baby Carrie as well. But they're kind of late on thick. But if you get malaria, it's like the illness that never leaves you. That's Laura. They had a big windstorm. They talk a lot about the wind in there. Hard to show a picture of that. But in the middle of one windstorm, there was a scream. They thought it was a person. Pa goes off in the middle of the night to their nearest neighbor, several miles away. And when he's coming back, he finds out the screaming is coming from this terribly portrayed mountain lion. But it's true to the behavior the mountain lions tend when they feel threatened to hole up on trees. Apparently had an antelope in. And one last carnivore story. Pa told the story that he just took a ride exploring, looking, and they came across a herd of 50 wolves. Now, I thought this was a tall tale. At the time, I didn't have a gun, and the 50 wolves ran all around me, and I tried to make sure the horse wouldn't run because I knew we'd all be eaten, which probably could have been true. So I look up at the American prairie wolf, which is extinct now. They ran in packs of 50 to 100. There was a very unusual, it's the only place where they would occur in such large numbers because they would chase the great herd, the bison. And the Indians would say it only took 3 wolves to bring down a bull bison. And so I'm looking around, and sure enough, George Catlin has painted the prairie wolf in these big packs, pulling one bison aside. Bison can give it as well as take it right there. You find this out all the time in Yellowstone. Same. What's going to doom the Native Americans, though, is the extinction of the bison. That was their entire way of life. This is a collection of bison skulls, and it was sent to the east not for artwork or anything, but to turn into fertilizer. They were after the bison were all killed, and there's just bones laying across the plains. Everything was used. That man's sitting on 40,000 hides. So the interesting thing, when you read the Little House on the Prairie, there are no bison. So you can already see that everything is slipping away. And that's probably why the Osage were willing to give up, because if you're going to be a plains indigenous person, you have to have it's all predicated on the great herd. And of course, there's the end. She's right up there with Willa Cather and my Antonia and Old Pioneers, just the love of the land and when I was a young child, I always thought the Great Plains would be the end of the earth, and I've always been impressed with the deep love of the place. And of course, there is a prairie fire, and this is the little girl remembering all the animals fleeing. It's true to the Ozark experience that Native Americans always have used fire. The first people in adopted the way to manage the forests, and we still have a problem with it, but people still burn. This was unintentional. She said that bunny, rabbit, jumped the bucket of water. They built a fire break, their house survived. And that's really it. I will say that Pa, when confronted with the U.S. soldiers that were brought in, saying that they were poaching or squatting on Indian land, packed up and left. He is the only person I know in American history who lost to the Indians. And I suspect that he had some sort of concern about dealing with the government going back to the Civil War, because within the year, all those Osage Indians were in Oklahoma. But he, it's an adult woman trying to explain something that you cannot explain. And we really don't know why. We don't know why. He just folded and left. But he goes back to Wisconsin, ends up in Minnesota, and finally they'll settle. Most of the books in the Little House series are in South Dakota. They get too old to keep chasing the frontier. And that's it. I don't know how long I went, but I'm done. Too long?
We'll have a couple minutes for a couple quick questions. I realize we're up on time. Do you have any questions for Scott? I'm sure he'll hang around. Go ahead.
Where are they buried?
I'm sorry?
Where is the family buried?
I believe the Laura Ingalls Wilder and her husband Almanzo are down in Mansfield, at the Rocky Ridge Farm.
Okay.
I believe Caroline and Charles are buried in DeSmet. DeSmet, South Dakota.